Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today we're going to talk about how to install TrueNAS Scale on your QNAP NAS system. This is a follow-up to my TrueNAS Core video, which is hopefully live by now. Let me know, it should be linked in the description if it's not. But in today's video, I'm going to show you how to install the Linux version of TrueNAS on a QNAP NAS. Before we go any further, much like my previous video, time for some disclaimers. First and foremost, when I'm recording this intro and bits of today's video, I am doing it while two NASes just off camera, one rack mount, one desktop, are absolutely gunning away building RAID configurations. One of them a RAID 50, the other one a standard RAID. But you can hear their fans in the distance. I've had to kind of move my office around a little bit here and have the mic this close to my face just so I can really dampen that sound and get some of it out in the edit. So I apologise if my sound is a little bit weird in this video. The second thing is, of course, although this video is about TrueNAS Scale being installed on a QNAP, I think it would be very important not to address some of the stuff about QNAP here. Number one, when you buy a QNAP NAS system, you are getting a hardware and software combined solution when you buy it. Much like any turnkey solution, you are getting something that you buy, put it down, connect it, and you're pretty much good to go. That's the whole point of buying network attached storage devices. Things like TrueNAS Scale and TrueNAS Core, with the exception of when you buy like an iXsystems NAS, are software only. They're open source, freeware type software there, which you need to supply and build the bits and bobs. And that's why a lot of people buy NASes, because they want that turnkey ability. But a lot of users who have a QNAP NAS system either don't realise what they can do with the software, or have heard too many good things about TrueNAS and they want to install it on the QNAP. Now, I would strongly recommend, before you do this, to take some time with QuTS 5. Number one, it is an incredibly user-friendly software platform. Two, it has a lot, and I mean a lot, of software features that are just not available on TrueNAS, and indeed on any other NAS platform there, in terms of some of the features and functionality and the support of third-party services out there. Another thing, if you've got data on your QNAP in that RAID array, if you install TrueNAS on this system, it's going to wipe that data when creating those new data sets there. So if you're going to do this, back up. Or if you can't back up because it's too much data, 50, 60, 70 terabytes or whatever, don't attempt this, because you will lose your data, and you should have a backup in place anyway. Another thing to bear in mind when going for this kind of upgrade here is that although what we are doing today does not replace QuTS on this system, and indeed what it does is create a new configuration and create a dual OS architecture, still nonetheless, what you're doing right now may invalidate your warranty. I'm not 100%, and I don't know too much about the warranty and support factor there, but if you do this, I can't guarantee that QNAP, if you have a problem with the device, won't contact you back and go, well, the reason it's not booting is because you've dicked around with the OS and the DOM. So bear that in mind with what you're doing with this upgrade. But without further ado, let's crack on with the video. Now, before we install TrueNAS Scale on a QNAP NAS, we have to talk about the things you're going to need. And the first thing you're going to need, unsurprisingly, it's a bloody NAS, isn't it? You're going to need a QNAP NAS for this installation, be it old or new. Now, there are limitations to which kind of QNAPs you can use. First and foremost, it's got to be a NAS that's got an x86 64-bit processor. That means things like an ARM, a Realtek, a Marvell, and a Purna, they're right out the window. Ignore those, it's not going to work. And particularly, you need a CPU that has embedded graphics on it in terms of QNAP NAS. And I'll get into a bit more detail in a bit why, but I'm talking about Celerons, Pentiums, i3, i5, i9, i7, etc. I'm talking about R6 Radeon-based controllers there from AMD. Second thing you're going to need is at least 8 gig of memory. If you don't use at least 8 gig of memory, you're not going to get the best experience out of TrueNAS Scale. It's recommended also that you can scale up to 16, but make sure you start with at least 8 gig for the best possible experience there. This is the TS453E that I'm going to be utilising in today's video, and I will say that it has 8 gig that can't be upgraded. So what you're going to see today is the experience of 8 gig of memory running TrueNAS. The third thing you're going to need, as far as the QNAP is concerned, is one with an HDMI output there. And again, this is why I talked about an embedded graphics CPU, because during the installation of TrueNAS Scale, part of the installation requires a KVM, keyboard, video, mouse, but you won't need the mouse, setup. So you can interface with it and set up TrueNAS, and then after that the whole thing can be done remotely via the network. Now you can technically do the setup over the network with the right BIOS network settings, but I don't recommend it. It's tremendously complex, and if something goes wrong, it could go really wrong. So try to go for a QNAP with an HDMI out, at least 8 gig of memory, and a CPU that's a 64-bit x86 embedded graphics processor there. Right, so that's enough for the QNAP. Next up, we've got to talk about the other accessories you are going to need. Next thing you're going to need is a USB drive. In this case, I am utilizing a SanDisk UltraFit 32 gig module here, and this is 130 megabytes per second USB. That's about 8 or 9 Nika shopping around. It's also incredibly tiny. This is the USB that I used in my TerraMaster TrueNAS installation videos. And although you can use any USB drive realistically, the reason I'm still using this one, other than the fact it's clearly still in my office, is because it's very small and gives at least 100 megs. The 100 megs bit is here or there. That's really just the installation. I want to know that it's a reliable disk that's not going to drop midway through the installation. But the size is so it doesn't accidentally get removed, because we will be removing it later on, but bigger USB sticks, something could knock it, moving it around, all kinds of stuff there. So that's why I recommend that a USB of this kind, and it'll be linked in the description below. Next thing we're going to need is that KVM setup. So you're going to need an HDMI monitor, but if you don't have an HDMI monitor, you can use an HDMI capture card if you choose. That's what I'm going to be utilizing in order to record today's footage to show you later on. But this is going to be at its best if you have an HDMI monitor that you can just pop in, even a TV that you've got knocking around. You're also going to need a USB keyboard. Don't use a Bluetooth keyboard. Don't use a radio wireless keyboard. Both of those, there's no guarantees that it will work, and there's no guarantees you won't drop connection halfway through the installation. It's not worth it. Use an old bog standard USB 2 PS2 keyboard. They're like a knicker at Poundland, right? Next, you're going to need some storage media. Now, if you use the storage media, as I mentioned earlier, that's already in your QNAP, that might get wiped. Don't risk it. If you're going to keep the installation of QTS, move those drives to another location, or back up the content of those drives safely along with the config files of QTS. But other than that, make sure you got some storage media for your data sets, your volume pools, etc. Another thing, and another reason I've gone for this, and this is an optional one, I've gone for a QNAP NAS that has an M2 NVMe slot on the inside there. Now, most of the modern generation QNAPs that fit the caliber that we talked about today, that knock around for between 400 quid to £1,000, they have M2 NVMe slots inside that allow you to install a super fast SSD. 60 gig and 120 gig USBs there are really cheap these days, and you're not even going to need that much space. But the reason I recommend it is because when you put the TrueNAS installation on the USB and connect it to this device, the TrueNAS Scale is going to ask you, where's the destination? Where is it installing TrueNAS? And when it installs the TrueNAS application, you've got to point it at a target. Now, if you've got multiple hard drives inside this system and you point at one of these drives, you pretty much lose access to that drive. You can create partitions. It's not recommended. It will affect performance. You need to put TrueNAS on a standalone bit of media so it can work parallel with your storage media, and that's particularly good for migration and moving TrueNAS data sets. But the other thing is, some people say, oh, you can stick in a USB drive and install TrueNAS on the USB. And given a lot of these QNAPs are USB 3.2 Gen 2, that's 1,000 megs. That's not, that's pretty good performance. I disagree. Again, USBs can be accidentally removed. Software fail, USB hardware fail. Do not install TrueNAS Scale on a USB drive. Either use a low-sized drive, an SSD ideally, inside one of the bays, or utilize an M2 NVMe inside and install TrueNAS on that. And that means that TrueNAS will be running as an operating system, like PC or Mac users know, will be running super fast, and it will free up all the storage bays for your data sets within TrueNAS Scale. But that's really it. That's everything you need in terms of hardware. So what we're going to do now is make our way over to the desktop PC. From there, I'm going to show you the two things you need to download to create your installation USB for TrueNAS Scale, and that's going to be Rufus and downloading an ISO of TrueNAS Scale, and then we're going to move it over and install it inside our QNAP. I'm going to walk you through the entire installation right the way up to the GUI of TrueNAS Scale. Let's make our way over to the laptop. Okay, so we've made our way onto the desktop of my PC here to download TrueNAS Scale. Right away, again, as mentioned in the description, there should be links to everything I'm going to talk about, as well as, hopefully, if I've written it in time, the full written walkthrough for today's guide on installing TrueNAS Scale on a QNAP NAS. So the first thing you want to go to is truenas.com/download TrueNAS Scale. Fairly straightforward URL, that one. And as you can see here, you can sign up to get access to the download link and get the newsletters. But you don't really have to do that if you don't want to. And go right there to that bottom that says, no, I've already signed up. Then what you need to do is download, ideally, the most stable version. You can go ahead and use the experimental features or the kind of in production features of the beta version, but I wouldn't recommend it for your first installation. Build on stable and then maybe get used to it and then go from there. Just clicking there will download an ISO, a disk image digitally of TrueNAS Scale. So just go ahead, I've already downloaded it, but just click download stable and boom, it'll go to you. The next thing you need is Rufus, a freeware application, open source, that allows you to create a bootable USB. Do you remember that USB I told you to have? The reason for that is because unlike a lot of PCs in the day that used to boot from BIOS with a disk, most NASs do not have optical disk drives. So you need to turn that digital disk image there, that ISO, into a bootable USB. That's why you needed the USB, but you need Rufus to do it. And straight away, you can scroll down to the bottom and download version 3.20. Make sure you've got the one that's got the graphical user interface. And also, I would also recommend the portable version because you're not going to need to use this loads and loads. The last thing, and I'll connect the USB because this might make the point a little bit more clearly. If you connect some USB sticks, you will be presented on screen with an option to format USB. Now, in this case, it hasn't seemingly happened, but if you are utilizing a USB that needs to be formatted before you can interact with it at all, you can normally right-click on any disk drive inside your available system. As you can see, it's asking me to format, and when you right-click it in the C drive, so we'll go into the C drive there, you can see the drive there isn't accessible. You can right click and you can format this drive if you choose to, and then from there, when you format the drive, you have to make sure that you format it to FAT32, which unfortunately isn't going to be an available option for large drives in some areas where the drive is larger than, I believe, 16 or 32 gigabytes. I always forget. So in that case, if you want that easy to do, then you can go ahead and go to and download this tool here, and it allows you to format larger than 32 gig drives there very easily. So that's it. These are the things you're going to need. You could ignore that one there. You need TrueNAS Scale, you need Rufus, and you need GUI format if you need to format the drive for it to be visible. But in many cases, Rufus on its own will be able to see the USB anyway. It's just a question of making sure your system has recognized it. And if your system hasn't recognized it there, then what you can do is click Computer there at the top. And this works obviously on Windows 10 Pro. It's not quite the same on most systems. Go to Manage. And then from Manage, you can cycle through, find the drive. So go into Storage, go into double-click Disk Management, and it will list the available connected drives. And there you can see there is that connected drive there. And one of the reasons it's having a problem is there's a partition there, which we can right-click if we choose to and start formatting or removing partitions. Alternatively, you can just go to the bottom and type in disk part, which is a great little tool that you can utilize. It's built into your window. If it's gone black there, that's because Windows is asking for my permission. And you can type the option list disk, and it lists the available disk. And if you look, the third option there, disk 2, that's my drive. And you can select that disk. So select disk 2, as you see there. And if I choose to, I can clean the drive just by selecting the word clean. And boom, that will format that drive much, much faster. But that won't take care of the formatting that we mentioned earlier on. But as you can see, that drive now is no longer available because I've cleaned that directory. So don't worry, I'll show you in a moment what we're going to do. The next thing we need to do is head into Rufus that we've downloaded earlier. Double click. And again, you might see a black screen there on screen. That's just Windows looking for my permission, and it should load up in the middle of the screen. As you can see, it's found that disk device no label, and now it's asking me to add a bootable ISO. That's the ISO that we downloaded earlier, the TrueNAS Scale ISO file. So for now, click select. It will open up directories. From there, go to where you downloaded the file, in my case TrueNAS Scale there. Then click open, and it will add this drive and get ready to create our new ISO digital USB bootable device. And that's it. You don't have to change any of the other options. As you can see, it's going to flash it with FAT32 anyway. So from there, we can click start. You may ask about the write mode. You can go ahead. You're not going to need it load. You can just go ahead and go for the recommended ISO settings. It will warn you that the drive is going to be completely formatted, and then click OK. And then from there, it will now format and create our bootable TrueNAS Scale ISO, which we can then do safely removing from the system in just a moment, which I'll show you. And then from there, we can get it connected to the back or the front of our QNAP NAS. I also recommend that you put the USB inside an available USB 3 port if you've got it, rather than a USB 2 port, mainly because you're going to be using one of the USB 2 ports for that keyboard that I mentioned earlier on, but also just because the performance is better via the USB, and there's certain power advantages to USB keys in a USB 3 port, which when you're using an installation and you're having the drive read from quite a lot, is quite useful and good to have that information to hand. So right now it's almost done. We're at 97%. It will be done very, very shortly. So while it's doing that, we can get ready and set up our NAS in just a moment. But I'll pop that to one side. We're just going to leave it now while I boringly talk to you on screen, waiting for a little green bar to finish. And there you go. It's done. So now we can click close there. Go in the case of Windows Pro systems, so it will be different if you're a Mac user. Go to the bottom right options there. Find the USB. Right click and eject your USB safely there. And there you go, that's now safely ejected our USB key. We can now remove it, and there's our USB. And now let's head our way back to the studio, where I can show you setting up this device for the first time. Okay, so time to start getting our hands a little bit dirty here during the installation of either TrueNAS Core or TrueNAS Scale. That's right, I'm going to use this little middle bit of the video in both installations of when I do Core and Scale. Sue me. So, right now we have got our TS453E. Again, remember you're going to need one that's got an HDMI output, and we're going to want to start connecting things. The last thing we want to connect, by the way, is the power. Now, one thing I'm not going to show you is the installation of an M2 NVMe SSD. The reason being that different QNAP NASs have the ports for these in very different places. In the case, for example, of the TS464, I'm looking off camera because that's actually in use right now, unfortunately, you can connect that inside the bays. There's a little slot there. In the case of this NAS, you have to take the chassis apart and connect it inside. So ultimately, if you are going to install TrueNAS Core on an M2 NVMe, then you're going to have to make sure to check out the hardware guide from QNAP depending on where that is. I've already installed it inside here. This isn't the drive I'm going to be using. I've already put one inside. But for you, if you are going to use an M2 NVMe, make sure you've installed that first before you've done anything else at all. Next thing, make sure you get your storage media connected. Again, in my case, I'm going to be utilising a couple of 4TB drives here. And these 4TB drives, again, if there is any data on these, it's going to get formatted. Okay, now you could use an existing data set. I've not tried to migrate over an existing paired a couple of drives in TrueNAS from an existing TrueNAS server. TrueNAS is supposed to be considerably easier to migrate data sets from one system to another, big volume pools. And again, I've not tried that on the QNAP. And remember, you're going to be installing the OS on another drive, not on the drive you're installing inside. So maybe it is migratable, but because I've not tried it personally, I'm slightly reluctant to recommend that here. But again, make sure you've got at least a couple of drives so you've got that redundancy option there, and have those drives installed. And again, I know I keep saying it, and I know I'm being repetitious, but you will lose the data on these drives from a QNAP installation if you try this. So make sure that data is backed up. And again, we're coming fast to a point where we're going to start the installation, and there's a lot of work to roll back to QTS 5 if you wish. So next up, we've got our USB. Now, as mentioned, I recommend using a USB 3 port on this system. Personally, I've tried this on this very system here on the front port, but again, which one you use is up to you, but I do recommend using at least a USB 3.2 Gen 1 port on there. And then finally, we want to install our KV-NOT-M setup there. So we've got my keyboard, which we're going to install there. Have that ready. And again, almost certainly you've got a QNAP with at least one USB 2 port, so you might as well use one of those and have that connected there. Have your keyboard ready, and then you need your monitor. Again, as mentioned, I'm not using a monitor, I'm using a capture card here, but just make sure you've got a monitor that you're utilizing. Connect it into the QNAP first. If it has got more than one HDMI port, make sure you go for the HDMI 1, because the HDMI ports on some of these NASs like this one that have two HDMI ports, they mirror one another, but during initial boot, only HDMI 1 will do an output, at least in BIOS anyway, so make sure you've got that connected there. And again, in your case, you're going to connect this to a monitor, but in my case, I'm connecting this into my laptop for the capture that we're going to do there. And that's it. I've now got the device set up. I've got my USB. In there. I've got my M2 SSD. I've got my KV set up there. I'm ready to go, pretty much all over. What I need to do now is connect power and the LAN. Now, connect the LAN first, although you're not going to need the LAN till much later in the installation for the network access. The power is the thing you're going to need to be concerned with installing it, because a lot of QNAPs at the moment have auto power on because of if there's power failure, and they like to do a recovery system. So once you attach the power, there's every possibility the system's going to begin booting immediately. Now, that in itself isn't a problem, but when we are patching into a QNAP via an HDMI output and a keyboard, what we're looking for is the initial boot of the USB. That's what we want to see. We want to see the initial boot, in my case USB, in your case HDMI, of the motherboard. And when that's going in there, we want to press either F12 or delete to go into the BIOS. And then from there, we'll be able to make sure we select our USB. So if you attach the power to your QNAP and you're not ready at the keyboard, just hold the power button down and let the device power down. So in this case, I'm going to connect it. And in my case, I've heard a couple of noises and the system is now booting, and I don't want it to do that yet. So I'm going to power it down. You may not need to do this if you're already set up for it, but in my case, I don't want this system to boot up yet. I want to be ready so I can get ready to capture it on that BIOS there. And that's it. We've got the system ready. We've got our keyboard ready. What we want to do now is get ready at our screen, press the power and get ready to go into BIOS, which I'm now going to show you on this screen. So 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, so the system is booting up. Right now you can hear the fan in the background, so I apologise for that kind of background hum you're going to hear for the rest of the video. Really sorry about that. It's really tough to control the noise here today with so much hardware, but eventually we should hear a beep there from the NAS system denoting that initialization has completed, and we should see a little splash there on screen, and we want to spam the delete or F12 button. You have about 15 seconds to do it there, but from there we should have the BIOS screen there in front of us. What we need to do is tap the right key here on there, and what you want to do is now you will see a series of drives shown on screen. The one at the top there is the QNAP OS. That is the little module inside that boots QTS for the very first time. If you're using an SSD like I am, such as that Seagate you see there on screen, the little SSD for your boot, if you're using a preset drive inside for that OS, then it might appear here on that listing. Mine is, but we can largely ignore it. But what we're interested in is that one, the USB OS. That's the USB we've got inside there for TrueNAS Scale. Now what we need to do is head over to the next tab, go down, and where it says Unify OS USB, we have to get ready to press enter. Now before we do that, a few things straight off the bat. If later on, after we've installed TrueNAS Scale, and I'll show you this again later, so you don't have to remember this, but just a little warning, later on I'm going to ask you to remove the USB drive. That is really important, because when you try to boot this device again, it's going to be very important that you make sure the QNAP is pointed at the right drive later on. So this is just a quick warning that we're going to be coming back to this screen later, and you have to remember to remove that USB. I will remind you again later, but it's very important. But for now, make sure you've selected the OS USB option there and click enter. That will now go into a boot sequence here from the TrueNAS installation USB there. And what it's going to try to do is boot that installer for TrueNAS there, as you can see there on screen. If you don't tap anything for a couple of seconds, it immediately boots into the installer sequence there, which is really, really important. If, for example, you already have TrueNAS installed and you'd left that USB in there, it would have recognized that TrueNAS is on board, which is fine, and it would have booted from it. But it can be problematic during the boot sequence there. So again, it's very important that for now, that USB is in there, but later on when I tell you to remove it, that you definitely remove that USB. I'm going to fast forward to the beginning of the initialization of this USB and TrueNAS Scale. And now we've made our way into the installer. It takes a little bit of time for it to go in there. And again, sometimes if there are different components and the way the QNAP is built and there's an error, you'll see that there on screen. And again, if you press the wrong key or you're tapping there on enter, that can happen as well, as I found out when I put the keyboard down too forcefully. But the first option we want to go for is install upgrade, that top one there. We don't want to upgrade, we're going for an installation there of TrueNAS Scale. And what it's going to do now is prepare the installer. Now it's noticed that there are 3 available drives inside there. There's my Seagate Iron Wolf, that's the SSD that I've put inside that M2, but there's also a couple of hard drives, those 4 TBs. Remember, we want to install the TrueNAS Scale OS on a nice fast drive, the SSD. Now, so you select the drive that you've done by putting the spacebar. So tap the spacebar on the drive that you want to install TrueNAS Scale onto. Remember, you're not installing this on the drives that you're going to use for your storage. This is much like Windows or Mac OS being on its own SSD. Then scroll down and then tap enter. From there, it will now move on to the next page, and where it will let you know that during this upgrade, if you are running a fresh installation, to select there. My SSD that's got inside there has got some data on side. We don't want to bother with any of that. You may see a different screen to this in just a moment, but if you're using an SSD that has TrueNAS or other OS on board, you may be asked if you want to go ahead with an upgrade or a refresh. In my case, this is a fresh installation. I also want to completely remove and format the drive for future use. Now, if you format the drive, as it will alert you, it will completely delete any data that's on that drive. Remember, if you're using a completely clean drive, the last 2 or 3 steps won't have appeared and you'll be straight here. But just bear in mind that 1, the drive that you are going to install TrueNAS Scale on will be white. And secondly, that you shouldn't use a USB drive, because again, it can cause performance and connection issues there. But for now, let's go ahead with that installation. We have to create ourselves a password. This is going to be used in conjunction with the username root, R-O-O-T, as our primary login there. Now we can disable admin or create sub-accounts if we choose to later on. But for now, we can go ahead with the password we've decided to put in there. And from this point, it's now going to start the initialization in just a moment. We don't need to bother with a swap partition, completely unnecessary for this installation. Click no swap. And there you go, it's now going to begin the creation of this TrueNAS Scale installation and full OS drive. Now, this can take time, depending on the speed of the drive you're using, the power of the system you're using, and more. The amount of time it takes for the installation to take place, and particularly the speed of the USB as well, the extraction and installation of the TrueNAS Scale archive can take anywhere from 5 to 25 minutes. So sit tight and wait for when the system refreshes this blue screen right the way back to the install and upgrade option. Let's fast forward. And now we're back at that installation screen from the beginning. It took around about 7 or 8 minutes there, but for now just tap enter, and what we want to do now is go down to shut down system as an option. Select that, and the next thing we need to do is get that USB out there. So wait for a moment and wait till the QNAP spins down. Now, again, you might be looking at a black screen. Don't just wait until you see a complete black screen. Wait until you see the fan on the front of the system cease. Once that's happened, or you can hear the fan stop, I should say, go in and remove that USB drive. It's really, really important you do that. You don't have to do that, but it will be problematic otherwise. Take that USB and pop it to one side. Now again, leave all of your keyboard, your monitor, or in my case a capture device, and all that stuff reconnected, because you're still going to need it now when we make our way back into BIOS. So again, reboot the device. You'll hear it spin up for the first time, and wait until you hear the beep of the QNAP. And again, start tapping delete and F12. Again, it will depend on the motherboard you choose, but delete or F12. As soon as you hear the beep, just start tapping that button, because that will allow us to get into BIOS there. So wait until we hear the beep. Come on, QNAP, don't let me down. There we go. And we can just tap it there, because you want to catch that. And here we are back on the BIOS. And this time we want to tap the right key and get to boot. Tap down, and as you can see, the USB drive has gone. But as you can see, the boot option priority has changed slightly there. I've selected it so that it is the Seagate Iron Wolf there. That is the drive that I want to boot. But if your drive and the OS drive that you picked for TrueNAS Scale to be there isn't on boot option 1, make sure that you go in and select it as boot 1. By default, some users should still see the layout like this. They should see QNAP OS at the top. But again, make sure you change it to the drive that you have installed TrueNAS Scale on. And again, just before we proceed any further, remember, if you want to reverse what we've done today, what you need to do is remove the drives, or if you want to format the drives that you're using in TrueNAS, leave them in there, head back into BIOS just like we've done now, which you can only do with a keyboard and a monitor. Head in, select boot option 1, and make sure QNAP OS is boot option 1. If you do that, then you're able to reboot the system back into QNAP OS. And if you've still got the drives that you had in your QNAP, that's got all of your data and all of the apps and everything in QTS, you can put those back in and boot straight back into QNAP OS. But again, what we want to do, I'm sorry if this is getting confusing, make sure, final, that the drive that you're using for TrueNAS Scale is there on boot option 1. So from here, we'll go ahead and we want to save changes and reset, and then click enter, and then click save configuration. And now the QNAP is going to reboot, but this time it's going to immediately boot into TrueNAS Scale. And when it does that, it will begin unpacking that initial installation there. It will take longer to boot up the first time than it will for other times when you boot up your new TrueNAS Scale installed QNAP, but it should still be very straightforward indeed. And while it does that, and we'll wait until we hear the boot and we see the screen change slightly, so we should see it change now to the TrueNAS installation splash screen, as you can see there. And as you can see, it's going to count down and it'll automatically boot in 1 second. And now it's going to boot our installation of TrueNAS Scale there that's living on the SSD that we installed it onto. Now, the amount of time this takes, again, will depend on the power of the system you are using. This can, again, take as little as 3 to 5 minutes, or it can take 10 to 20 minutes as it goes through it, as it enables things, checks what works, checks what doesn't, before it eventually boots TrueNAS Scale and then allows you to access your connected storage drives and start creating your data sets, volumes, and pools. But it is also worth highlighting that just because we're connected to this device right now via HDMI and a keyboard, you don't need to do that long term. A lot of users use these devices when they want to connect with their TrueNAS system via command line, much like SSH, but you almost certainly want to connect with your TrueNAS via your web browser or remotely. Now, in order to do that, you're going to need to know its IP. Now, when the installation, the initial installation and initialization of our TrueNAS Scale system that's happening right now completes, it will give us our IP. Now, while it's doing that in the background, I can recommend a great tool for finding the IP of your TrueNAS long term without you having to connect all this stuff next time as it boots it there in the background. If I flick the display here onto the top of the screen and bring myself back there onto the top of the screen, into the corner of the device. This is OBS running here in the background. You can ignore that there. Let's pop me at the top. There I am. And if we make our way into my web browser, you're able to see this tool. It should be linked in the description, Advanced IP Scanner. Advanced IP Scanner is a completely free tool that allows you to scan your local area environment, your network local area environment, and find devices. Anything that's on your network that's sharing the same Wi-Fi, they will be listed here as long as you've got that kind of network open up to be searchable, which most users do by default. Now, it's a completely free tool, absolutely free to download, and once you've got it up and running, all you need to do is select the scan option, and it will now scan your local area network for all of the devices, everything, TVs, consoles, laptops, phones, you name it. If it's on the network, it will appear here, and they'll start appearing on a list here, including our TrueNAS system. It normally takes about a minute or two to do a whole network scan, so while it's doing that, why don't we go ahead and make our way back into the HDMI output of our TrueNAS Scale there. So let's pop that back there. And as we can see, it's still unpacking TrueNAS Scale. So at the moment, it's still going to take a few more minutes before TrueNAS Scale completely initializes and TrueNAS Scale on our QNAP NAS is completely finished. So let's fast forward to the completion of its initialization. And the installation and initialization is complete. As you can see there, via the HDMI output and the keyboard, we're able to go through the command setup there if we choose to, and go through some of the different client options open to us via the command line and HDMI here on TrueNAS Scale installed on the QNAP. However, let's be honest, that's not the way you want to do it as mentioned. Let's make our way into the web browser, because luckily, as we can see there, we now know this device's network IP 192.168.1.140. So what we're going to do is head over to the web browser. As we can see here, let's open it up, and indeed, as mentioned earlier on, there's our network scanner. If we choose to, we can open up the network scanner, and as we can see there at IP 140, the QNAP has appeared. There is our IP. We can right click, we can copy our IP if we choose, and even if we didn't want to wait for that HDMI output, we can just straight away head here, open it up, and now we are making our way into our TrueNAS Scale graphical user interface here on the browser. So we enter root, and then we enter the password that we created earlier on, and boom, we are now in TrueNAS Scale, the Linux version of TrueNAS here on a QNAP NAS here. So we've got that set up here, we've got our hardware information there, there's our setup, there's the CPU for the TS453E, and you want to go ahead and start making your storage, don't you? So you can go ahead into your storage area there and start creating ourselves a pool. So we can call it a name. We'll call this one Pool 1. And then from there, select our two 4TB drives that we installed from earlier in the video. Add those into the overall array. Click down. If we'd had more drives, we'd have the option of RAID 5, RAID 6, ZFS RAIDs and that sort of thing. We can go ahead and add those as we see fit, and then we can go ahead and click create. We can even do some more attachment stuff and more. And that's really it. That is the installation of TrueNAS Scale on a QNAP NAS. There's lots more to learn here. We can go ahead and start creating our pools. We can go ahead into the App Center and start downloading some of the applications if we choose to, and all the available ones, but of course we need a pool to do that first. We can go ahead and start creating a lot more of our data retention policies, our security, and more. But ultimately, it means that if you have an old QNAP lying around, you can now start putting TrueNAS Core on that system. So that is it. There should be a guide in the description in the next few days, call it a week at most, the full written breakdown guide on how to install TrueNAS Scale on your QNAP NAS here. Hopefully it will be there over on NAS Compares, along with links to all of the resources that we've used today and all of the hardware I've used today, with links to Amazon, so you can support the channel. Thank you very much. Apart from that, I just want to once again remind you, 1, make sure you remove that USB after the installation. 2, make sure you change the boot drive there from the internal QNAP OS one to the drive that you've used to install TrueNAS Scale on, and also turn them back if you want to reverse back into QTS later down the line. And also remember, I'm not entirely certain if what we've done today will invalidate the support or warranty you have with QNAP. So do make sure you bear that in mind before proceeding. You have purchased an item as a turnkey solution, a hardware-software combined solution there. Now you're using it in a way that it wasn't designed to be used originally, which can always be dicey when it comes to support from any brand. So know what you are doing, have your data backed up, and treat this more as an experiment But if you want to use this as long-term storage, I would personally have faith in this setup, as much as I have faith as well in QTS from QNAP. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Click like if you have, and subscribe to learn more. We've already done TrueNAS Core. This has been TrueNAS Scale, and soon we're going to do Unraid on this system. Let me know if there's any other OSs you want me to play with in the comments. Use the free advice section and the guides over on NAS Compares. And if you need a helping hand, use the free advice section, or you can use Ask NAS Compares, our free forum that's manned by me, Eddie the web guy, Eddie more than me, I'll be honest with you, and the NAS community to help answer your questions. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.